The Murdered Cousin by J.Sheridan Le Fanu and read by Christopher Halton. And they lay wait for their own blood, they lurk privily for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone that is greedy of gain, which taketh away the life of the owner thereof. This story of the Irish peerage is written, as nearly as possible, in the very words in which it was related by its heroine, the late Countess D, and is therefore told in the first person. My mother died when I was an infant, and of her I have no recollection, even the faintest. By her death my education was left solely to the direction of my surviving parent. He entered upon his task with a stern appreciation of the responsibility thus cast upon him. My religious instruction was prosecuted with an almost exaggerated anxiety, and I had, of course, the best masters to perfect me in all those accomplishments which my station and wealth might seem to require. My father was what is called an oddity, and his treatment of me, though uniformly kind, was governed less by affection and tenderness than by a high and unbending sense of duty. Indeed, I seldom saw or spoke to him except at meal-times, and then, though gentle, he was usually reserved and gloomy. His leisure hours, which were many, were passed either in his study or in solitary walks. In short, he seemed to take no further interest in my happiness or improvement than a conscientious regard to the discharge of his own duty would seem to impose. Shortly before my birth, an event occurred which had contributed much to induce and to confirm my father's unsocial habits. It was the fact that a suspicion of murder had fallen upon his younger brother, though not sufficiently definite to lead to any public proceedings, yet strong enough to ruin him in public opinion. This disgraceful and dreadful doubt cast upon the family name, my father felt deeply and bitterly, and not the less so that he himself was thoroughly convinced of his brother's innocence. The sincerity and strength of this conviction he shortly afterwards proved in a manner which produced the catastrophe of my story. Before, however, I enter upon my immediate adventures, I ought to relate the circumstances which had awakened that suspicion to which I have referred, inasmuch as they are in themselves somewhat curious, and in their effects most intimately connected with my own after-history. My uncle, Sir Arthur Tyrrell, was a gay and extravagant man, and among other vices was ruinously addicted to gaming. This unfortunate propensity, even after his fortune had suffered so severely as to render retrenchment imperative, nevertheless continued to engross him, nearly to the exclusion of every other pursuit. He was, however, a proud or rather a vain man, and could not bear to make the diminution of his income a matter of triumph to those with whom he had hitherto competed, and the consequence was that he frequented no longer the expensive haunts of his dissipation, and retired from the gay world, leaving his coterie to discover his reasons as best they might. He did not, however, forego his favourite vice, for though he could not worship his great divinity in those costly temples where he was formerly wont to take his place, yet he found it very possible to bring about him a sufficient number of the votaries of chance to answer all his ends. The consequence was that Carrickley, which was the name of my uncle's residence, was never without one or more of such visitors as I have described. It happened that upon one occasion he was visited by one Hugh Tisdall, a gentleman of loose and indeed low habits, but of considerable wealth, and who had in early youth travelled with my uncle upon the continent. The period of this visit was winter, and consequently the house was nearly deserted excepting by its ordinary inmates. It was therefore highly acceptable, particularly as my uncle was aware that his visitor's tastes accorded exactly with his own. Both parties seemed determined to avail themselves of their mutual suitability during the brief stay which Mr. Tisdall had promised. The consequence was that they shut themselves up in Sir Arthur's private room for nearly all the day and the greater part of the night during the space of almost a week, at the end of which the servant, having one morning, as usual, knocked at Mr. Tisdall's bedroom door repeatedly, received no answer, and upon attempting to enter, found that it was locked. This appeared suspicious, and the inmates of the house having been alarmed, the door was forced open, and on proceeding to the bed, they found the body of its occupant perfectly lifeless and hanging halfway out, the head downwards, and near the floor. One deep wound had been inflicted upon the temple, apparently with some blunt instrument which had penetrated the brain, and another blow, less effective, probably the first aimed, had grazed his head, removing some of the scalp. The door had been double-locked upon the inside, in evidence of which the key still lay where it had been placed in the lock. The window, though not secured on the interior, was closed, a circumstance not a little puzzling, as it afforded the only other mode of escape from the room. It looked out, too, upon a kind of courtyard, round which the old building stood, formerly accessible by a narrow doorway and passage lying in the oldest side of the quadrangle, but which had since been built up, so as to preclude all ingress or egress. The room was also upon the second story, and the height of the window considerable. In addition to all which, the stone window-sill was much too narrow to allow of anyone standing upon it when the window was closed. Near the bed were found a pair of razors belonging to the murdered man, one of them upon the ground, and both of them open. The weapon which inflicted the mortal wound was not to be found in the room, nor were any footsteps or other traces of the murderer discoverable. At the suggestion of Sir Arthur himself, the coroner was instantly summoned to attend, and an inquest was held. Nothing, however, in any degree conclusive was elicited. The walls, ceiling and floor of the room were carefully examined, in order to ascertain whether they contained a trapdoor or other concealed mode of entrance, but no such thing appeared. Such was the minuteness of investigation employed, that although the grate had contained a large fire during the night, they proceeded to examine even the very chimney, in order to discover whether escape by it were possible. But this attempt too was fruitless, for the chimney, built in the old fashion, rose in a perfectly perpendicular line from the hearth to a height of nearly 14 feet above the roof, affording in its interior scarcely the possibility of ascent, the flue being smoothly plastered and sloping towards the top like an inverted funnel. Promising too, even if the summit were attained, owing to its great height, but a precarious descent upon the sharp and steep ridge roof. The ashes too, which lay in the grate, and the soot, as far as it could be seen, were undisturbed, a circumstance almost conclusive upon the point. Sir Arthur was of course examined. His evidence was given with clearness and unreserve, which seemed calculated to silence all suspicion. He stated that up to the day and night immediately preceding the catastrophe, he had lost to a heavy amount, but that at their last sitting he had not only won back his original loss, but upwards of £4,000 in addition, in evidence of which he produced an acknowledgment of debt to that amount in the handwriting of the deceased, bearing date the night of the catastrophe. He had mentioned the circumstance to Lady Tyrrell and in presence of some of his domestics, which statement was supported by their respective evidence. One of the jury shrewdly observed that the circumstance of Mr. Tisdall's having sustained so heavy a loss might have suggested to some ill-minded persons, accidentally hearing it, the plan of robbing him, after having murdered him in such a manner as might make it appear that he had committed suicide, a supposition which was strongly supported by the razors having been found thus displaced and removed from their case. Two persons had probably been engaged in the attempt, one watching by the sleeping man and ready to strike him in case of his awakening suddenly, while the other was procuring the razors and employed in inflicting the fatal gash, so as to make it appear to have been the act of the murdered man himself. It was said that while the juror was making this suggestion, Sir Arthur changed colour. There was nothing, however, like legal evidence to implicate him, and the consequence was that the verdict was found against a person or persons unknown, and for some time the matter was suffered to rest, until, after about 5 months, my father received a letter from a person signing himself Andrew Collis, and representing himself to be the cousin of the deceased. This letter stated that his brother Sir Arthur was likely to incur not merely suspicion, but personal risk, unless he could account for certain circumstances connected with the recent murder, and contained a copy of a letter written by the deceased and dated the very day upon the night of which the murder had been perpetrated. Tisdall's letter contained, among a great deal of other matter, the passages which follow. I have had sharp work with Sir Arthur. He tried some of his stale tricks, but soon found that I was Yorkshire too. It would not do, you understand me. We went to the work like good ones, head, heart and soul. And in fact, since I came here, I have lost no time. I am rather fagged, but I am sure to be well paid for my hardship. I never want sleep so long as I can have the music of a dice box and wherewithal to pay the piper. As I told you, he tried some of his queer turns, but I foiled him like a man, and in return gave him more than he could relish of the genuine dead knowledge. In short, I have plucked the old baronet as never baronet was plucked before. I have scarce left him the stump of a quill. I have got promissory notes in his hand to the amount of blank. If you like round numbers, say £25,000, safely deposited in my portable strong box, alias double-class pocket book. I leave this ruinous old rat-hole early on tomorrow for 2 reasons. First, I do not want to play with Sir Arthur deeper than I think his security would warrant. And secondly, because I am safer 100 miles away from Sir Arthur than in the house with him. Look you, my worthy, I tell you this between ourselves. I may be wrong, but I am sure as that I am now living, that Sir Arthur attempted to poison me last night, so much for old friendship on both sides. When I won the last stake, a heavy one enough, my friend leant his forehead upon his hands, and you'll laugh when I tell you that his head literally smoked like a hot dumpling. I do not know whether his agitation was produced by the plan which he had against me, or by his having lost so heavily, though it must be allowed that he had reason to be a little funked whichever way his thoughts went, but he pulled the bell and ordered 2 bottles of champagne. While the fellow was bringing them, he wrote a promissory note to the full amount, which he signed, and as the man came in with the bottles and glasses, he desired him to be off. He filled a glass for me, and while he thought my eyes were off, for I was putting up his note at the time, he dropped something slyly into it, no doubt to sweeten it, but I saw it all, and when he handed it to me, I said, with an emphasis which he might easily understand, "There is some sediment in it, I'll not drink it." "Is there?" said he, and at the same time snatched it from my hand and threw it into the fire. "What do you think of that? Have I not a tender bird in hand? Win or lose, I will not play beyond 5,000 tonight, and tomorrow sees me safe out of the reach of Sir Arthur's champagne." Of the authenticity of this document I never heard my father express a doubt, and I am satisfied that, owing to his strong conviction in favour of his brother, he would not have admitted it without sufficient inquiry, inasmuch as it tended to confirm the suspicions which already existed to his prejudice. Now, the only point in this letter which made strongly against my uncle was the mention of the double-class pocket-book as the receptacle of the papers likely to involve him, for this pocket-book was not forthcoming, nor anywhere to be found, nor had any papers referring to his gaming transactions been discovered upon the dead man. But whatever might have been the original intention of this man, Collis, neither my uncle nor my father ever heard more of him. He published the letter, however, in Faulkner's newspaper, which was shortly afterwards made the vehicle of a much more mysterious attack. The passage in that journal to which I allude appeared about 4 years afterwards, and while the fatal occurrence was still fresh in public recollection. It commenced by a rambling preface stating that a certain person whom certain persons thought to be dead was not so but living and in full possession of his memory, and moreover ready and able to make great delinquents tremble. It then went on to describe the murder, without however mentioning names, and in doing so it entered into minute and circumstantial particulars of which none but an eye-witness could have been possessed, and by implications almost too unequivocal to be regarded in the light of insinuation, to involve the titled gambler in the guilt of the transaction. My father at once urged Sir Arthur to proceed against the paper in an action of libel, but he would not hear of it nor consent to my father's taking any legal steps whatever in the matter. My father, however, wrote in a threatening tone to Faulkner, demanding a surrender of the author of the obnoxious article. The answer to this application is still in my possession, and is penned in an apologetic tone. It states that the manuscript had been handed in, paid for, and inserted as an advertisement without sufficient inquiry or any knowledge as to whom it referred. No step, however, was taken to clear my uncle's character in the judgment of the public, and as he immediately sold a small property, the application of the proceeds of which were known to none, he was said to have disposed of it to enable himself to buy off the threatened information. However the truth might have been, it is certain that no charges respecting the mysterious murder were afterwards publicly made against my uncle, and as far as external disturbances were concerned, he enjoyed henceforward perfect security and quiet. A deep and lasting impression, however, had been made upon the public mind, and Sir Arthur Tyrrell was no longer visited or noticed by the gentry of the county, whose attentions he had hitherto received. He accordingly affected to despise those courtesies which he no longer enjoyed, and shunned even that society which he might have commanded. This is all that I need recapitulate of my uncle's history, and I now recur to my own. Although my father had never within my recollection visited or been visited by my uncle, each being of unsocial, procrastinating and indolent habits, and their respective residences being very far apart, the one lying in the county of Galway, the other in that of Cork, he was strongly attached to his brother, and evinced his affection by an active correspondence, and by deeply and proudly resenting that neglect which had branded Sir Arthur as unfit to mix in society. When I was about 18 years of age, my father, whose health had been gradually declining, died, leaving me in heart wretched and desolate, and, owing to his habitual seclusion, with few acquaintances, and almost no friends. The provisions of his will were curious, and when I was sufficiently come to myself to listen to or comprehend them, surprised me not a little. All his vast property was left to me, and to the heirs of my body for ever, and in default of such heirs, it was to go after my death to my uncle Sir Arthur, without any entail. At the same time the will appointed him my guardian, desiring that I might be received within his house, and reside with his family and under his care during the term of my minority, and in consideration of the increased expense consequent upon such an arrangement, a handsome allowance was allotted to him during the term of my proposed residence. The object of this last provision I at once understood. My father desired, by making it the direct apparent interest of Sir Arthur, that I should die without issue, while at the same time he placed my person wholly in his power, to prove to the world how great and unshaken was his confidence in his brother's innocence and honour. It was a strange, perhaps an idle scheme, but as I had been always brought up in the habit of considering my uncle as a deeply injured man, and had been taught, almost as a part of my religion, to regard him as the very soul of honour, I felt no further uneasiness respecting the arrangement than that likely to affect a shy and timid girl at the immediate prospect of taking up her abode for the first time in her life among strangers. Previous to leaving my home, which I felt I should do with a heavy heart, I received a most tender and affectionate letter from my uncle, calculated, if anything could do so, to remove the bitterness of parting from scenes familiar and dear from my earliest childhood, and in some degree to reconcile me to the measure. It was upon a fine autumn day that I approached the old domain of Carricklay. I shall not soon forget the impression of sadness and of gloom which all that I saw produced upon my mind. The sunbeams were falling with a rich and melancholy lustre upon the fine old trees, which stood in lordly groups, casting their long sweeping shadows over rock and sward. There was an air of neglect and decay about the spot, which amounted almost to desolation, and mournfully increased as we approached the building itself, near which the ground had been originally more artificially and carefully cultivated than elsewhere, and where consequently neglect more immediately and strikingly betrayed itself. As we proceeded, the road wound near the beds of what had been formerly 2 fish ponds, which were now nothing more than stagnant swamps, overgrown with rank weeds, and here and there encroached upon by the straggling underwood. The avenue itself was much broken, and in many places the stones were almost concealed by grass and nettles. The loose stone walls which had here and there intersected the broad park were in many places broken down, so as no longer to answer their original purpose as fences. Piers were now and then to be seen, but the gates were gone, and to add to the general air of dilapidation, some huge trunks were lying scattered through the venerable old trees, either the work of the winter storms, or perhaps the victims of some extensive but desultory scheme of denudation, which the projector had not capital or perseverance to carry into full effect. After the carriage had travelled a full mile of this avenue, we reached the summit of a rather abrupt eminence, one of the many which added to the picturesqueness, if not to the convenience of this rude approach. From the top of this ridge the grey walls of Carrickley were visible, rising at a small distance in front, and darkened by the hoary wood which crowded around them. It was a quadrangular building of considerable extent, and the front, where the great entrance was placed, lay towards us, and bore unequivocal marks of antiquity. The time-worn, solemn aspect of the old building, the ruinous and deserted appearance of the whole place, and the associations which connected it with a dark page in the history of my family, combined to depress spirits already predisposed for the reception of sombre and dejecting impressions. When the carriage drew up in the grass-grown courtyard before the hall door, two lazy-looking men, whose appearance well accorded with that of the place which they tenanted, alarmed by the obstreperous barking of a great chained dog, ran out from some half-ruinous outhouses, and took charge of the horses. The hall door stood open, and I entered a gloomy and imperfectly lighted apartment, and found no one within it. However, I had not long to wait in this awkward predicament, for before my luggage had been deposited in the house, indeed before I had well removed my cloak and other muffles, so as to enable me to look around, a young girl ran lightly into the hall, and kissing me heartily and somewhat boisterously, exclaimed, "My dear cousin, my dear Margaret, I am so delighted, so out of breath. We did not expect you till 10 o'clock. My father is somewhere about the place. He must be close at hand. James, Corney, run out and tell your master. My brother is seldom at home, at least at any reasonable hour. You must be so tired, so fatigued. Let me show you to your room. See that Lady Margaret's luggage is all brought up. You must lie down and rest yourself. Deborah, bring some coffee up these stairs. We are so delighted to see you. You cannot think how lonely I have been. How steep these stairs are not they? I am so glad you are come. I could hardly bring myself to believe that you were really coming. How good of you, dear Lady Margaret." There was real good nature and delight in my cousin's greeting, and a kind of constitutional confidence of manner which placed me at once at ease, and made me feel immediately upon terms of intimacy with her. The room into which she ushered me, although partaking in the general air of decay which pervaded the mansion and all about it, had nevertheless been fitted up with evident attention to comfort, and even with some dingy attempt at luxury. But what pleased me most was that it opened by a second door upon a lobby which communicated with my fair cousin's apartment, a circumstance which divested the room, in my eyes, of the air of solitude and sadness which would otherwise have characterized it to a degree almost painful to one so depressed and agitated as I was. After such arrangements as I found necessary were completed, we both went down to the parlour, a large wainscoted room, hung round with grim old portraits, and, as I was not sorry to see, containing in its ample grate a large and cheerful fire. Here my cousin had leisure to talk more at her ease, and from her I learned something of the manners and the habits of the two remaining members of her family, whom I had not yet seen. On my arrival I had known nothing of the family among whom I was come to reside, except that it consisted of 3 individuals, my uncle and his son and daughter, Lady Tyrrell having been long dead. In addition to this very scanty stock of information, I shortly learned from my communicative companion that my uncle was, as I had suspected, completely retired in his habits, and besides that, having been, so far back as she could well recollect, always rather strict as reform rakes frequently become, he had latterly been growing more gloomily and sternly religious than heretofore. Her account of her brother was far less favourable, though she did not say anything directly to his disadvantage. From all that I could gather from her, I was led to suppose that he was a specimen of the idle, coarse-mannered, profligate squirearchy, a result which might naturally have followed from the circumstance of his being, as it were, outlawed from society, and driven for companionship to grades below his own, enjoying, too, the dangerous prerogative of spending a good deal of money. However, you may easily suppose that I found nothing in my cousin's communication fully to bear me out in so very decided a conclusion. I awaited the arrival of my uncle, which was every moment to be expected, with feelings half of alarm, half of curiosity, a sensation which I have often since experienced, though to a less degree, when upon the point of standing for the first time in the presence of one of whom I have long been in the habit of hearing or thinking with interest. It was, therefore, with some little perturbation that I heard, first a slight bustle at the outer door, then a slow step traverse the hall, and finally witnessed the door open and my uncle enter the room. He was a striking-looking man. From peculiarities both of person and of dress, the whole effect of his appearance amounted to extreme singularity. He was tall, and when young his figure must have been strikingly elegant. As it was, however, its effect was marred by a very decided stoop. His dress was of a sober colour, and in fashion anterior to anything which I could remember. It was, however, handsome, and by no means carelessly put on, but what completed the singularity of his appearance was his uncut white hair, which hung in long but not at all neglected curls, even so far as his shoulders, and which combined with his regularly classic features and fine dark eyes to bestow upon him an air of venerable dignity and pride which I have seldom seen equalled elsewhere. I rose as he entered and met him about the middle of the room. He kissed my cheek and both my hands, saying, "You are most welcome, dear child, as welcome as the command of this poor place and all that it contains can make you. I am rejoiced to see you, truly rejoiced. I trust that you are not much fatigued. Pray be seated again." He led me to my chair and continued, "I am glad to perceive you have made acquaintance with Emily already. I see in your being thus brought together the foundation of a lasting friendship. You are both innocent and both young. God bless you, and make you all that I could wish." He raised his eyes and remained for a few moments silent, as if in secret prayer. I felt that it was impossible that this man, with feelings manifestly so tender, could be the wretch that public opinion had represented him to be. I was more than ever convinced of his innocence. His manners were, or appeared to me, most fascinating. I know not how the lights of experience might have altered this estimate, but I was then very young, and I beheld in him a perfect mingling of the courtesy of polished life with the gentlest and most genial virtues of the heart. A feeling of affection and respect towards him began to spring up within me, the more earnest that I remembered how sorely he had suffered in fortune and how cruelly in fame. My uncle, having given me fully to understand that I was most welcome and might command whatever was his own, pressed me to take some supper, and on my refusing he observed that before bidding me good night he had one duty further to perform, one in which he was convinced I would cheerfully acquiesce. He then proceeded to read a chapter from the Bible, after which he took his leave with the same affectionate kindness with which he had greeted me, having repeated his desire that I should consider everything in his house as altogether at my disposal. It is needless to say how much I was pleased with my uncle. It was impossible to avoid being so, and I could not help saying to myself, if such a man as this is not safe from the assaults of slander, who is? I felt much happier than I had done since my father's death, and enjoyed that night the first refreshing sleep which had visited me since that calamity. My curiosity respecting my male cousin did not long remain unsatisfied. He appeared upon the next day at dinner. His manners, though not so coarse as I had expected, were exceedingly disagreeable. There was an assurance and a forwardness for which I was not prepared. There was less of the vulgarity of manner, and almost more of that of the mind, than I had anticipated. I felt quite uncomfortable in his presence. There was just that confidence in his look and tone which would read encouragement even in mere toleration, and I felt more disgusted and annoyed at the coarse and extravagant compliments which he was pleased from time to pay me, than perhaps the extent of the atrocity might fully have warranted. It was, however, one consolation that he did not often appear, being much engrossed by pursuits about which I neither knew nor cared anything, but when he did, his attentions, either with a view to his amusement or to some more serious object, were so obviously and perseveringly directed to me, that young and inexperienced as I was, even I could not be ignorant of their significance. I felt more provoked by this odious persecution than I can express, and discouraged him with so much vigour that I did not stop even at rudeness to convince him that his assiduities were unwelcome, but all in vain. This had gone on for nearly a 12-month to my infinite annoyance, when one day, as I was sitting at some needlework with my companion Emily, as was my habit, in the parlour, the door opened, and my cousin Edward entered the room. There was something I thought odd in his manner, a kind of struggle between shame and impudence, a kind of flurry and ambiguity which made him appear, if possible, more than ordinarily disagreeable. "Your servant, ladies," he said, seating himself at the same time. "Sorry to spoil your tete-a-tete, but never mind. I'll only take Emily's place for a minute or two, and then we part for a while, fair cousin. Emily, my father wants you in the corner turret. No shilly-shally, he's in a hurry." She hesitated. "Be off, tramp march, I say," he exclaimed, in a tone which the poor girl dared not disobey. She left the room, and Edward followed her to the door. He stood there for a minute or two as if reflecting what he should say, perhaps satisfying himself that no one was within hearing in the hall. At length he turned about, having closed the door, as if carelessly, with his foot, and advancing slowly in deep thought, he took his seat at the side of the table opposite to mine. There was a brief interval of silence, after which he said, "I imagine that you have a shrewd suspicion of the object of my early visit, but I suppose I must go into particulars. Must I?" "I have no conception," I replied, "what your object may be." "Well, well," said he, becoming more at his ease as he proceeded, "it may be told in a few words. You know that it is totally impossible, quite out of the question, that an off-hand young fellow like me and a good-looking girl like yourself could meet continually as you and I have done, without an attachment, a liking growing up on one side or other. In short, I think I have let you know as plainly as if I spoke it, that I have been in love with you almost from the first time I saw you." He paused, but I was too much horrified to speak. He interpreted my silence favourably. "I can tell you," he continued, "I'm reckoned rather hard to please and very hard to hit. I can't say when I was taken with a girl before, so you see fortune reserved me." Here the odious wretch actually put his arm round my waist. The action at once restored me to utterance, and with the most indignant vehemence I released myself from his hold, and at the same time said, "I have, sir, of course, perceived your most disagreeable attentions. They have long been a source of great annoyance to me, and you must be aware that I have marked my disapprobation, my disgust, as unequivocally as I possibly could, without actual indelicacy." I paused, almost out of breath from the rapidity with which I had spoken, and without giving him time to renew the conversation, I hastily quitted the room, leaving him in a paroxysm of rage and mortification. As I ascended the stairs, I heard him open the parlour door with violence, and take 2 or 3 rapid strides in the direction in which I was moving. I was now much frightened, and ran the whole way until I reached my room, and having locked the door, I listened breathlessly, but heard no sound. This relieved me for the present, but so much had I been overcome by the agitation and annoyance attendant upon the scene which I had just passed through, that when my cousin Emily knocked at the door, I was weeping in great agitation. You will readily conceive my distress, when you reflect upon my strong dislike to my cousin Edward, combined with my youth and extreme inexperience. Any proposal of such a nature must have agitated me, but that it should come from the man whom, of all others, I instinctively most loathed and abhorred, and to whom I had, as clearly as manner could do it, expressed the state of my feelings, was almost too annoying to be borne. It was a calamity, too, in which I could not claim the sympathy of my cousin Emily, which had always been extended to me in my minor grievances. Still I hoped that it might not be unattended with good, for I thought that one inevitable and most welcome consequence would result from this painful éclaircissement in the discontinuance of my cousin's odious persecution. When I arose next morning, it was with the fervent hope that I might never again behold his face, or even hear his name. But such a consummation, though devoutedly to be wished, was hardly likely to occur. The painful impressions of yesterday were too vivid to be at once erased, and I could not help feeling some dim foreboding of coming annoyance and evil. To expect on my cousin's part anything like delicacy or consideration for me was out of the question. I saw that he had set his heart upon my property, and that he was not likely easily to forego such a prize, possessing what might have been considered opportunities and facilities almost to compel my compliance. I now keenly felt the unreasonableness of my father's conduct in placing me to reside with a family, with all the members of which, with one exception, he was wholly unacquainted, and I bitterly felt the helplessness of my situation. I determined, however, in the event of my cousin's persevering in his addresses, to lay all the particulars before my uncle, although he had never, in kindness or intimacy, gone a step beyond our first interview, and to throw myself upon his hospitality and his sense of honour for protection against a repetition of such annoyances. My cousin's conduct may appear to have been an inadequate cause for such serious uneasiness, but my alarm was awakened neither by his acts nor by words, but entirely by his manner, which was strange and even intimidating. At the beginning of our yesterday's interview there was a sort of bullying swagger in his air, which towards the end gave place to something bordering upon the brutal vehemence of an undisguised ruffian, a transition which had tempted me into a belief that he might seek, even forcibly, to extort from me a consent to his wishes, or by means still more horrible, of which I scarcely dared to trust myself to think, to possess himself of my property. I was early next day summoned to attend my uncle in his private room, which lay in a corner turret of the old building, and thither I accordingly went, wondering all the way what this unusual measure might prelude. When I entered the room, he did not rise in his usual courteous way to greet me, but simply pointed to a chair opposite to his own. This boded nothing agreeable. I sat down, however, silently waiting until he should open the conversation. "Lady Margaret," at length he said, in a tone of greater sternness than I thought him capable of using, "I have hitherto spoken to you as a friend, but I have not forgotten that I am also your guardian, and that my authority as such gives me a right to control your conduct. I shall put a question to you, and I expect and will demand a plain, direct answer. Have I rightly been informed that you have contemptuously rejected the suit in hand of my son Edward?" I stammered forth with a good deal of trepidation. "I believe, that is, I have, sir, rejected my cousin's proposals, and my coldness and discouragement might have convinced him that I had determined to do so." "Madam," replied he with suppressed, but, as it appeared to me, intense anger, "I have lived long enough to know that coldness and discouragement, and such terms, form the common cant of a worthless coquette. You know to the full, as well as I, that coldness and discouragement may be so exhibited as to convince their object that he is neither distasteful nor indifferent to the person who wears that manner. You know, too, none better, that an affected neglect, when skilfully managed, is amongst the most formidable of the allurements which artful beauty can employ. I tell you, madame, that having, without one word spoken in discouragement, permitted my son's most marked attentions for a 12-month or more, you have no right to dismiss him with no further explanation than demurely telling him that you had always looked coldly upon him, and neither your wealth nor your ladyship — there was an emphasis of scorn on the word which would have become Sir Giles Overreach himself — can warrant you in treating with contempt the affectionate regard of an honest heart." I was too much shocked at this undisguised attempt to bully me into an acquiescence in the interested and unprincipled plan for their own aggrandizement, which I now perceived my uncle and his son had deliberately formed at once to find strength or collectedness to frame an answer to what he had said. At length I replied with a firmness that surprised myself. "In all that you have just now said, sir, you have grossly misstated my conduct and motives. Your information must have been most incorrect as far as it regards my conduct towards my cousin. My manner towards him could have conveyed nothing but dislike, and if anything could have added to the strong aversion which I have long felt towards him, it would be his attempting thus to frighten me into a marriage which he knows to be revolting to me, and which is sought by him only as a means for securing to himself whatever property is mine." As I said this, I fixed my eyes upon those of my uncle, but he was too old in the world's ways to falter beneath the gaze of more searching eyes than mine. He simply said, "Are you acquainted with the provisions of your father's will?" I answered in the affirmative, and he continued, "Then you must be aware that if my son Edward were, which God forbid, the unprincipled, reckless man, the ruffian you pretend to think him—" Here he spoke very slowly, as if he intended that every word which escaped him should be registered in my memory, while at the same time the expression of his countenance underwent a gradual but horrible change, and the eyes which he fixed upon me became so darkly vivid that I almost lost sight of everything else. "If he were what you have described him, do you think, child, he would have found no shorter way than marriage to gain his ends? A single blow, an outrage not a degree worse than you insinuate, would transfer your property to us." I stood staring at him for many minutes after he had ceased to speak, fascinated by the terrible serpent-like gaze, until he continued with a welcome change of countenance. "I will not speak again to you upon this topic until 1 month has passed. You shall have time to consider the relative advantages of the two courses which are open to you. I should be sorry to hurry you to a decision. I am satisfied with having stated my feelings upon the subject and pointed out to you the path of duty. Remember this day month, not one word sooner." He then rose, and I left the room much agitated and exhausted. This interview, all the circumstances attending it, but most particularly the formidable expression of my uncle's countenance while he talked, though hypothetically of murder, combined to arouse all my worst suspicions of him. I dreaded to look upon the face that had so recently worn the appalling livery of guilt and malignity. I regarded it with the mingled fear and loathing with which one looks upon an object which has tortured them in a nightmare. In a few days after the interview, the particulars of which I have just detailed, I found a note upon my toilet table, and on opening it I read as follows: "My dear Lady Margaret, you will be perhaps surprised to see a strange face in your room today. I have dismissed your Irish maid and secured a French one to wait upon you, a step rendered necessary by my proposing shortly to visit the continent with all my family. Your faithful guardian, Arthur Tyrrell." On inquiry, I found that my faithful attendant was actually gone and far on her way to the town of Galway, and in her stead there appeared a tall, raw-boned, ill-looking, elderly Frenchwoman, whose sullen and presuming manners seemed to imply that her vocation had never before been that of a lady's maid. I could not help regarding her as a creature of my uncle's, and therefore to be dreaded, even had she been in no other way suspicious. Days and weeks passed away without any, even a momentary doubt upon my part, as to the course to be pursued by me. The allotted period had at length elapsed. The day arrived upon which I was to communicate my decision to my uncle. Although my resolution had never for a moment wavered, I could not shake off the dread of the approaching colloquy, and my heart sank within me as I heard the expected summons. I had not seen my cousin Edward since the occurrence of the grand éclaircissement. He must have studiously avoided me. I suppose from policy it could not have been from delicacy. I was prepared for a terrific burst of fury from my uncle as soon as I should make known my determination, and I not unreasonably feared that some act of violence or of intimidation would next be resorted to. Filled with these dreary forebodings, I fearfully opened the study door, and the next minute I stood in my uncle's presence. He received me with a courtesy which I dreaded, as arguing a favourable anticipation respecting the answer which I was to give, and after some slight delay he began by saying, It will be a relief to both of us, I believe, to bring this conversation as soon as possible to an issue. You will excuse me then, my dear niece, for speaking with a bluntness which under other circumstances would be unpardonable. You have, I am certain, given the subject of our last interview fair and serious consideration, and I trust that you are now prepared with candour to lay your answer before me. A few words will suffice. We perfectly understand one another." He paused, and I, though feeling that I stood upon a mine which might in an instant explode, nevertheless answered with perfect composure, "I must now, sir, make the same reply which I did upon the last occasion, and I reiterate the declaration which I then made, that I never can nor will, while life and reason remain, consent to a union with my cousin Edward." This announcement wrought no apparent change in Sir Arthur, except that he became deadly, almost lividly pale. He seemed lost in dark thought for a minute, and then, with a slight effort, said, "You have answered me honestly and directly, and you say your resolution is unchangeable. Well, would it had been otherwise? Would it had been otherwise? But be it as it is, I am satisfied." He gave me his hand. It was cold and damp as death. Under an assumed calmness, it was evident that he was fearfully agitated. He continued to hold my hand with an almost painful pressure, while, as if unconsciously, seeming to forget my presence, he muttered, "Strange, strange, strange indeed. Fatuity, helpless fatuity." There was here a long pause. "Madness indeed to strain a cable that is rotten to the very heart. It must break, and then all goes." There was again a pause of some minutes, after which, suddenly changing his voice and manner to one of wakeful alacrity, he exclaimed, "Margaret, my son Edward shall plague you no more. He leaves this country tomorrow for France. He shall speak no more upon this subject. Never, never more. Whatever events depended upon your answer must now take their own course. But as for this fruitless proposal, it has been tried enough. It can be repeated no more." At these words he coldly suffered my hand to drop, as if to express his total abandonment of all his projected schemes of alliance, and certainly the action, with the accompanying words, produced upon my mind a more solemn and depressing effect than I believe possible to have been caused by the course which I had determined to pursue. It struck upon my heart with an awe and heaviness which will accompany the accomplishment of an important and irrevocable act, even though no doubt or scruple remains to make it possible that the agent should wish it undone. "Well," said my uncle after a little time, "we now cease to speak upon this topic, never to resume it again. Remember, you shall have no farther uneasiness from Edward. He leaves Ireland for France tomorrow. This will be a relief to you. May I depend upon your honour that no word touching the subject of this interview shall ever escape you?" I gave him the desired assurance. He said, "It is well. I am satisfied. We have nothing more, I believe, to say upon either side, and my presence must be a restraint upon you. I shall therefore bid you farewell." I then left the apartment, scarcely knowing what to think of the strange interview which had just taken place. On the next day my uncle took occasion to tell me that Edward had actually sailed, if his intention had not been prevented by adverse winds or weather, and 2 days after he actually produced a letter from his son, written, as it said, on board, and dispatched while the ship was getting under way. This was a great satisfaction to me, and as being likely to prove so, it was no doubt communicated to me by Sir Arthur. During all this trying period I had found infinite consolation in the society and sympathy of my dear cousin Emily. I never in after life formed a friendship so close, so fervent, and upon which, in all its progress, I could look back with feelings of such unalloyed pleasure, upon whose termination I must ever dwell with so deep, so yet unembittered a sorrow. In cheerful converse with her, I soon recovered my spirits considerably, and passed my time agreeably enough, although still in the utmost seclusion. Matters went on smoothly enough, although I could not help sometimes feeling a momentary but horrible uncertainty respecting my uncle's character, which was not altogether unwarranted by the circumstances of the 2 trying interviews, the particulars of which I have just detailed. The unpleasant impression which these conferences were calculated to leave upon my mind was fast wearing away, when there occurred a circumstance, slight indeed in itself, but calculated irrepressibly to awaken all my worst suspicions and to overwhelm me again with anxiety and terror. I had one day left the house with my cousin Emily, in order to take a ramble of considerable length, for the purpose of sketching some favourite views, and we had walked about half a mile when I perceived that we had forgotten our drawing materials, the absence of which would have defeated the object of our walk. Laughing at our own thoughtlessness, we returned to the house, and leaving Emily outside, I ran upstairs to procure the drawing books and pencil which lay in my bedroom. As I ran up the stairs, I was met by the tall, ill-looking Frenchwoman, evidently a good deal flurried. "Que veut madame?" said she, with a more decided effort to be polite than I had ever known her make before. No matter," said I, hastily running by her in the direction of my room. "Madame," cried she in a high key, "restez ici s'il vous plaît, votre chambre n'est pas faite." I continued to move on without heeding her. She was some way behind me, and feeling that she could not otherwise prevent my entrance, for I was now upon the very lobby, she made a desperate attempt to seize hold of my person. She succeeded in grasping the end of my shawl, which she drew from my shoulders, but slipping at the same time upon the polished oak floor, she fell at full length upon the boards. A little frightened as well as angry at the rudeness of this strange woman, I hastily pushed open the door of my room, at which I now stood, in order to escape from her. But great was my amazement on entering to find the apartment preoccupied. The window was open, and beside it stood two male figures. They appeared to be examining the fastenings of the casement, and their backs were turned towards the door. One of them was my uncle. They both had turned on my entrance, as if startled. The stranger was booted and cloaked, and wore a heavy broad-leaved hat over his brows. He turned but for a moment and averted his face, but I had seen enough to convince me that he was no other than my cousin Edward. My uncle had some iron instrument in his hand, which he hastily concealed behind his back, and coming towards me said something as if in an explanatory tone, but I was too much shocked and confounded to understand what it might be. He said something about repairs, window frames, cold, and safety. I did not wait, however, to ask or to receive explanations, but hastily left the room. As I went downstairs, I thought I heard the voice of the Frenchwoman in all the shrill volubility of excuse, and others uttering suppressed but vehement imprecations, or what seemed to me to be such. I joined my cousin Emily quite out of breath. I need not say that my head was too full of other things to think much of drawing for that day. I imparted to her frankly the cause of my alarms, but at the same time as gently as I could, and with tears she promised vigilance, devotion, and love. I never had reason for a moment to repent the unreserved confidence which I then reposed in her. She was no less surprised than I at the unexpected appearance of Edward, whose departure for France neither of us had for a moment doubted, but which was now proved by his actual presence to be nothing more than an imposture practised, I feared, for no good end. The situation in which I had found my uncle had very nearly removed all my doubts as to his designs. I magnified suspicions into certainties, and dreaded night after night that I should be murdered in my bed. The nervousness produced by sleepless nights and days of anxious fears increased the horrors of my situation to such a degree that I at length wrote a letter to a Mr. Jeffreys, an old and faithful friend of my father's, and perfectly acquainted with all his affairs, praying him for God's sake to relieve me from my present terrible situation, and communicating without reserve the nature and grounds of my suspicions. This letter I kept sealed and directed for 2 or 3 days always about my person, for discovery would have been ruinous, in expectation of an opportunity which might be safely trusted of having it placed in the post office, as neither Emily nor I were permitted to pass beyond the precincts of the domain itself, which was surrounded by high walls formed of dry stone. The difficulty of procuring such an opportunity was greatly enhanced. At this time, Emily had a short conversation with her father, which she reported to me instantly. After some indifferent matter, he had asked her whether she and I were upon good terms, and whether I was unreserved in my disposition. She answered in the affirmative, and he then inquired whether I had been much surprised to find him in my chamber on the other day. She answered that I had been both surprised and amused. And what did she think of George Wilson's appearance? Who? Inquired she. Oh, the architect, he answered, who is to contract for the repairs of the house. He is accounted a handsome fellow. She could not see his face, said Emily, and she was in such a hurry to escape that she scarcely observed him. Sir Arthur appeared satisfied, and the conversation ended. This slight conversation, repeated accurately to me by Emily, had the effect of confirming, if indeed anything was required to do so, all that I had before believed as to Edward's actual presence, and I naturally became, if possible, more anxious than ever to dispatch the letter to Mr. Jeffreys. An opportunity at length occurred. As Emily and I were walking one day near the gate of the domain, a lad from the village happened to be passing down the avenue from the house. The spot was secluded, and as this person was not connected by service with those whose observation I dreaded, I committed the letter to his keeping, with strict injunctions that he should put it without delay into the receiver of the town post office. At the same time I added a suitable gratuity, and the man, having made many protestations of punctuality, was soon out of sight. He was hardly gone when I began to doubt my discretion in having trusted him, but I had no better or safer means of dispatching the letter, and I was not warranted in suspecting him of such wanton dishonesty as a disposition to tamper with it. But I could not be quite satisfied of its safety until I had received an answer, which could not arrive for a few days. Before I did, however, an event occurred which a little surprised me. I was sitting in my bedroom early in the day, reading by myself, when I heard a knock at the door. "Come in," said I, and my uncle entered the room. "Will you excuse me?" said he. "I sought you in the parlour, and thence I have come here. I desire to say a word to you. I trust that you have hitherto found my conduct to you such as that of a guardian towards his ward should be." I dared not withhold my assent. "And," he continued, "I trust that you have not found me harsh or unjust, and that you have perceived, my dear niece, that I have sought to make this poor place as agreeable to you as may be." I assented again, and he put his hand in his pocket, whence he drew a folded paper, and dashing it upon the table with startling emphasis, he said, "Did you write that letter?" The sudden and fearful alteration of his voice, manner, and face, but more than all the unexpected production of my letter to Mr. Jeffreys, which I at once recognised, so confounded and terrified me that I felt almost choking. I could not utter a word. "Did you write that letter?" he repeated, with slow and intense emphasis. "You did, liar and hypocrite. You dared to write that foul and infamous libel, but it shall be your last. Men will universally believe you mad if I choose to call for an inquiry. I can make you appear so. The suspicions expressed in this letter are the hallucinations and alarms of a moping lunatic. I have defeated your first attempt, madam, and by the holy God, if ever you make another, chains, darkness, and the keeper's whip shall be your portion." With these astounding words he left the room, leaving me almost fainting. I was now almost reduced to despair. My last cast had failed. I had no course left but that of escaping secretly from the castle and placing myself under the protection of the nearest magistrate. I felt if this were not done and speedily that I should be murdered. No one from mere description can have an idea of the unmitigated horror of my situation. A helpless, weak, inexperienced girl, placed under the power and wholly at the mercy of evil men, and feeling that I had it not in my power to escape for one moment from the malignant influences under which I was probably doomed to fall. With a consciousness, too, that if violence, if murder were designed, no human being would be near to aid me. My dying shriek would be lost in void space. I had seen Edward but once during his visit, and as I did not meet him again, I began to think that he must have taken his departure, a conviction which was to a certain degree satisfactory, as I regarded his absence as indicating the removal of immediate danger. Emily also arrived circuitously at the same conclusion, and not without good grounds, for she managed indirectly to learn that Edward's black horse had actually been for a day and part of a night in the castle stables, just at the time of her brother's supposed visit. The horse had gone, and as she argued, the rider must have departed with it. This point being so far settled, I felt a little less uncomfortable, when being one day alone in my bedroom, I happened to look out from the window, and to my unutterable horror, I beheld peering through an opposite casement my cousin Edward's face. Had I seen the evil one himself in bodily shape, I could not have experienced a more sickening revulsion. I was too much appalled to move at once from the window, but I did so soon enough to avoid his eye. He was looking fixedly down into the narrow quadrangle upon which the window opened. I shrunk back unperceived to pass the rest of the day in terror and despair. I went to my room early that night, but I was too miserable to sleep. At about 12 o'clock, feeling very nervous, I determined to call my cousin Emily, who slept, you will remember, in the next room, which communicated with mine by a second door. By this private entrance I found my way into her chamber, and without difficulty persuaded her to return to my room and sleep with me. We accordingly lay down together, she undressed, and I with my clothes on, for I was every moment walking up and down the room, and felt too nervous and miserable to think of rest or comfort. Emily was soon fast asleep, and I lay awake fervently longing for the first pale gleam of morning, and reckoning every stroke of the old clock, with an impatience which made every hour appear like 6. It must have been about 1 o'clock when I thought I heard a slight noise at the partition door between Emily's room and mine, as if caused by somebody's turning the key in the lock. I held my breath, and the same sound was repeated at the second door of my room, that which opened upon the lobby. The sound was here distinctly caused by the revolution of the bolt in the lock, and it was followed by a slight pressure upon the door itself, as if to ascertain the security of the lock. The person, whoever it might be, was probably satisfied, for I heard the old boards of the lobby creak and strain, as if under the weight of somebody moving cautiously over them. My sense of hearing became unnaturally, almost painfully acute. I suppose the imagination added distinctness to sounds vague in themselves. I thought that I could actually hear the breathing of the person who was slowly returning along the lobby. At the head of the staircase there appeared to occur a pause, and I could distinctly hear 2 or 3 sentences hastily whispered. The steps then descended the stairs, with apparently less caution. I ventured to walk quickly and lightly to the lobby door, and attempted to open it. It was indeed fast locked upon the outside, as was also the other. I now felt that the dreadful hour was come, but one desperate expedient remained. It was to awaken Emily, and by our united strength to attempt to force the partition door, which was slighter than the other, and through this to pass to the lower part of the house, whence it might be possible to escape to the grounds, and so to the village. I returned to the bedside and shook Emily, but in vain. Nothing that I could do availed to produce from her more than a few incoherent words. It was a death-like sleep. She had certainly drunk of some narcotic, as probably had I also, in spite of all the caution with which I had examined everything presented to us, to eat or drink. I now attempted, with as little noise as possible, to force first one door, then the other, but all in vain. I believe no strength could have effected my object, for both doors opened inwards. I therefore collected whatever movables I could carry thither, and piled them against the doors, so as to assist me in whatever attempts I should make to resist the entrance of those without. I then returned to the bed, and endeavoured again, but fruitlessly, to awaken my cousin. It was not sleep, it was torpor, lethargy, death. I knelt down and prayed with an agony of earnestness, and then, seating myself upon the bed, I awaited my fate with a kind of terrible tranquillity. I heard a faint clanking sound from the narrow court which I have already mentioned, as if caused by the scraping of some iron instrument against stones or rubbish. I at first determined not to disturb the calmness which I now experienced, by uselessly watching the proceedings of those who sought my life. But as the sounds continued, the horrible curiosity which I felt overcame every other emotion, and I determined at all hazards to gratify it. I therefore crawled upon my knees to the window, so as to let the smallest possible portion of my head appear above the sill. The moon was shining with an uncertain radiance upon the antique grey buildings, and obliquely upon the narrow court beneath. One side of it was therefore clearly illuminated, while the other was lost in obscurity, the sharp outlines of the old gables, with their nodding clusters of ivy, being at first alone visible. Whoever or whatever occasioned the noise which had excited my curiosity was concealed under the shadow of the dark side of the quadrangle. I placed my hand over my eyes to shade them from the moonlight, which was so bright as to be almost dazzling, and peering into the darkness, I first dimly, but afterwards gradually, almost with full distinctness, beheld the form of a man engaged in digging what appeared to be a rude hole close under the wall. Some implements, probably a shovel and pickaxe, lay beside him, and to these he every now and then applied himself as the nature of the ground required. He pursued his task rapidly and with as little noise as possible. So, thought I, as shovelful after shovelful the dislodged rubbish mounted into a heap, they are digging the grave in which, before 2 hours pass, I must lie, a cold mangled corpse. I am theirs. I cannot escape. I felt as if my reason was leaving me. I started to my feet, and in mere despair I applied myself again to each of the 2 doors alternately. I strained every nerve and sinew, but I might as well have attempted, with my single strength, to force the building itself from its foundations. I threw myself madly upon the ground, and clasped my hands over my eyes, as if to shut out the horrible images which crowded upon me. The paroxysm passed away. I prayed once more with the bitter, agonized fervour of one who feels that the hour of death is present and inevitable. When I arose, I went once more to the window and looked out, just in time to see a shadowy figure glide stealthily along the wall. The task was finished. The catastrophe of the tragedy must soon be accomplished. I determined now to defend my life to the last, and that I might be able to do so with some effect, I searched the room for something which might serve as a weapon, but either through accident or else in anticipation of such a possibility, everything which might have been made available for such a purpose had been removed. I must then die tamely and without an effort to defend myself. A thought suddenly struck me. Might it not be possible to escape through the door, which the assassin must open in order to enter the room? I resolved to make the attempt. I felt assured that the door through which ingress to the room would be effected was that which opened upon the lobby. It was the more direct way, besides being for obvious reasons less liable to interruption than the other. I resolved then to place myself behind a projection of the wall. The shadow would serve fully to conceal me, and when the door should be opened, and before they should have discovered the identity of the occupant of the bed, to creep noiselessly from the room, and then to trust to Providence for escape. In order to facilitate this scheme, I removed all the lumber which I had heaped against the door, and I had nearly completed my arrangements when I perceived the room suddenly darkened by the close approach of some shadowy object to the window. On turning my eyes in that direction, I observed at the top of the casement, as if suspended from above, first the feet, then the legs, then the body, and at length the whole figure of a man present itself. It was Edward Tyrrell. He appeared to be guiding his descent so as to bring his feet upon the centre of the stone block which occupied the lower part of the window, and having secured his footing upon this, he kneeled down and began to gaze into the room. As the moon was gleaming into the chamber, and the bed curtains were drawn, he was able to distinguish the bed itself and its contents. He appeared satisfied with his scrutiny, for he looked up and made a sign with his hand. He then applied his hands to the window frame, which must have been ingeniously contrived for the purpose, for with apparently no resistance the whole frame, containing casement and all, slipped from its position in the wall, and was by him lowered into the room. The cold night wind waved the bed curtains, and he paused for a moment. All was still again. and he stepped in upon the floor of the room. He held in his hand what appeared to be a steel instrument, shaped something like a long hammer. This he held rather behind him, while with 3 long tiptoe strides he brought himself to the bedside. I felt that the discovery must now be made, and held my breath in momentary expectation of the execration in which he would vent his surprise and disappointment. I closed my eyes. There was a pause, but it was a short one. I heard 2 dull blows, given in rapid succession. A quivering sigh, and the long-drawn heavy breathing of the sleeper was forever suspended. I unclosed my eyes and saw the murderer fling the quilt across the head of his victim. He then, with the instrument of death still in his hand, proceeded to the lobby door, upon which he tapped sharply twice or thrice. A quick step was then heard approaching, and a voice whispered something from without. Edward answered with a kind of shuddering chuckle, "Her ladyship is past complaining. Unlock the door in the devil's name, unless you're afraid to come in, and help me to lift her out of the window." The key was turned in the lock, the door opened, and my uncle entered the room. I have told you already that I had placed myself under the shade of a projection of the wall close to the door. I had instinctively shrunk down, cowering towards the ground on the entrance of Edward through the window. When my uncle entered the room, he and his son both stood so very close to me that his hand was every moment upon the point of touching my face. I held my breath and remained motionless as death. "You had no interruption from the next room," said my uncle. "No," was the brief reply. "Secure the jewels, Ned. The French harpy must not lay her claws upon them. You're a steady hand, by God. Not much blood, eh?" "Not 20 drops," replied his son, "and those on the quilt." "I'm glad it's over," whispered my uncle again. "We must lift the thing through the window and lay the rubbish over it." They then turned to the bedside and, winding the bedclothes round the body, carried it between them slowly to the window, and exchanging a few brief words with someone below, they shoved it over the window-sill, and I heard it fall heavily on the ground underneath. "I'll take the jewels," said my uncle. "There are 2 caskets in the lower drawer." He proceeded with an accuracy which, had I been more at ease, would have furnished me with matter of astonishment, to lay his hand upon the very spot where my jewels lay, and having possessed himself of them, he called to his son. "Is the rope made fast above?" "I'm no fool, to be sure it is," replied he. They then lowered themselves from the window, and I rose lightly and cautiously, scarcely daring to breathe, from my place of concealment, and was creeping towards the door, when I heard my uncle's voice in a sharp whisper exclaim, "Get up again! God damn you, you forgot to lock the room door!" And I perceived by the straining of the rope which hung from above that the mandate was instantly obeyed. Not a second was to be lost. I passed through the door, which was only closed, and moved as rapidly as I could, consistently with stillness, along the lobby. Before I had gone many yards, I heard the door through which I had just passed roughly locked on the inside. I glided down the stairs in terror, lest at every corner I should meet the murderer or one of his accomplices. I reached the hall and listened for a moment to ascertain whether all was silent around. No sound was audible. The parlour windows opened on the park, and through one of them I might, I thought, easily effect my escape. Accordingly I hastily entered, but to my consternation a candle was burning in the room, and by its light I saw a figure seated at the dinner table, upon which lay glasses, bottles, and the other accompaniments of a drinking party. 2 or 3 chairs were placed about the table irregularly, as if hastily abandoned by their occupants. A single glance satisfied me that the figure was that of my French attendant. She was fast asleep, having probably drank deeply. There was something malignant and ghastly in the calmness of this bad woman's features, dimly illuminated as they were by the flickering blaze of the candle. A knife lay upon the table, and the terrible thought struck me. Should I kill this sleeping accomplice in the guilt of the murderer, and thus secure my retreat? Nothing could be easier. It was but to draw the blade across her throat, the work of a second. An instant's pause, however, corrected me. No, thought I, the God who has conducted me thus far through the valley of the shadow of death will not abandon me now. I will fall into their hands, or I will escape hence, but it shall be free from the stain of blood. His will be done. I felt a confidence arising from this reflection, an assurance of protection which I cannot describe. There were no other means of escape, so I advanced with a firm step and collected mind to the window. I noiselessly withdrew the bars and unclosed the shutters. I pushed open the casement, and without waiting to look behind me, I ran with my utmost speed, scarcely feeling the ground beneath me, down the avenue, taking care to keep upon the grass which bordered it. I did not for a moment slacken my speed, and I had now gained the central point between the park gate and the mansion house. Here the avenue made a wider circuit, and in order to avoid delay, I directed my way across the smooth sward round which the carriageway wound, intending at the opposite side of the level, at a point which I distinguished by a group of old birch trees, to enter again upon the beaten track, which was from thence tolerably direct to the gate. I had, with my utmost speed, got about halfway across this broad flat, when the rapid tramp of a horse's hoofs struck upon my ear. My heart swelled in my bosom as though I would smother. The clattering of galloping hoofs approached. I was pursued. They were now upon the sward on which I was running. There was not a bush or a bramble to shelter me, and as if to render escape altogether desperate, the moon, which had hitherto been obscured, at this moment shone forth with a broad clear light, which made every object distinctly visible. The sounds were now close behind me. I felt my knees bending under me with the sensation which unnerves one in a dream. I reeled, I stumbled, I fell, and at the same instant the cause of my alarm wheeled past me at full gallop. It was one of the young fillies which pastured loose about the park, whose frolics had thus all but maddened me with terror. I scrambled to my feet and rushed on with weak but rapid steps, my sportive companion still galloping round and round me with many a frisk and fling, until, at length, more dead than alive, I reached the avenue gate and crossed the stile, I scarce knew how. I ran through the village, in which all was silent as the grave, until my progress was arrested by the hoarse voice of a sentinel, who cried, "Who goes there?" I felt that I was now safe. I turned in the direction of the voice, and fell fainting at the soldier's feet. When I came to myself, I was sitting in a miserable hovel, surrounded by strange faces, all bespeaking curiosity and compassion. Many soldiers were in it also. Indeed, as I afterwards found, it was employed as a guard-room by a detachment of troops quartered for that night in the town. In a few words, I informed their officer of the circumstances which had occurred, describing also the appearance of the persons engaged in the murder. And he, without further loss of time than was necessary to procure the attendance of a magistrate, proceeded to the mansion house of Carricklay, taking with him a party of his men. But the villains had discovered their mistake, and had effected their escape before the arrival of the military. The Frenchwoman was, however, arrested in the neighbourhood upon the next day. She was tried and condemned at the ensuing assizes, and previous to her execution confessed that she had a hand in making Hugh Tisdall's bed. She had been a housekeeper in the castle at the time, and a cher amie of my uncle's. She was in reality able to speak English like a native, but had exclusively used the French language, I suppose to facilitate her designs. She died the same hardened wretch she had lived, confessing her crimes only, as she alleged, that her doing so might involve Sir Arthur Tyrrell, the great author of her guilt and misery, and whom she now regarded with unmitigated detestation. With the particulars of Sir Arthur's and his son's escape, as far as they are known, you are acquainted. You are also in possession of their after fate, the terrible, the tremendous retribution which, after long delays of many years, finally overtook and crushed them. Wonderful and inscrutable are the dealings of God with his creatures. Deep and fervent as must always be my gratitude to heaven for my deliverance, effected by a chain of providential occurrences, the failing of a single link of which must have ensured my destruction, it was long before I could look back upon it with other feelings than those of bitterness, almost of agony. The only being that had ever really loved me, my nearest and dearest friend, ever ready to sympathize, to counsel, and to assist. the gayest, the gentlest, the warmest heart, the only creature on earth that cared for me. Her life had been the price of my deliverance, and I then uttered the wish, which no event of my long and sorrowful life has taught me to recall, that she had been spared, and that, in her stead, I were mouldering in the grave, forgotten and at rest. The end.